he spends an amazing amount of time very meticulously going through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, in order to understand deeply theoretical concepts in Aristotle's natural science. Suffice it to say here that this return to Aristotle by Heidegger, and in particular, this unorthodox approach to look, for instance, in the Nicomachean Ethics for understanding natural science, or even science more broadly, in the thought of Aristotle, is at the core of Heidegger's call for a wholesale destruction of the entire Western philosophical tradition. Because, according to Heidegger, the traditional emphasis of interpreters and thinkers after Aristotle on the physics and the metaphysics without having paid sufficient attention to things like the Nicomachean Ethics has resulted in millennia of failing to understand Aristotle's depths. The failure of the tradition consists in how the various thinkers and philosophers and theologians after Aristotle accepted too easily as a guiding principle itself that all knowledge could be rationally divided in an unproblematic way into theoretical or contemplative knowledge and practical or actionable knowledge and productive knowledge. And the way that this shows itself in the tradition can be seen especially in the various commentaries by the medieval scholastics titled things such as the rational division of the sciences. And we always have to keep in mind the word that's getting translated as science from Greek is episteme, and it means a particular kind of knowledge. But what Heidegger's point concerns is how the tradition of those various rational divisions of the sciences has gone very astray, because things such as reason or rational and science have very problematically become dogmatic in the tradition. And the consequences of that dogmatism throughout the tradition have led to what Heidegger's teacher Husserl refers to as the crisis of European sciences. Husserl is also getting this from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is the first to call for an entire destruction of the Western philosophical tradition because of the legacy of Plato's Socrates, which Nietzsche thinks is hyper-rationalism, and from which our understanding of all the sciences has followed, and mistakenly followed. Because, as both Nietzsche and Heidegger are going to argue, the emphasis upon logos has culminated in our nihilism of today. This is why Nietzsche and Heidegger return to the Greeks, but they don't return to Plato. They return to the earlier tradition, the term for which Nietzsche coins, namely the pre-Platonic tradition. And what he means by this is most especially Homer, the Greek tragic poets, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and Thucydides. And it can't be emphasized enough that all of the so-called return movements that characterize postmodern philosophy, whether one is talking about Nietzsche or Heidegger or Leo Strauss, but all of these return movements to the Greeks in order to reawaken the relevance of their thought for us today have as their goal the possibility of overcoming nihilism. And in particular, the nihilism that is attendant upon this thing that we refer to as technology. And I need to emphasize here that in accepting these categorizations of knowledge, the thinkers, philosophers, and theologians after Aristotle did not believe that any overlap was very significant. This is to say that they believed Aristotle was a systematic thinker, where we could say his system consists in the most facile possible way, namely a simple division between ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, physics, metaphysics, and on. And I go into great detail in this discussion about what Heidegger means by this, but just as a sample of what's to come, among the clearest statements that Heidegger makes about this comes from part 2 of a lecture course that he gave in the winter and summer semesters of 1951 and 1952 at the University of Freiburg, published subsequently under the title, What is Called Thinking. And what he says there is this: Aristotle's persistence in the questioning attitude separates the thinker, Aristotle, by an abyss from all that Aristotelianism, which, in the manner of all followers, falsifies what is problematical and so produces a clear-cut counterfeit answer. And what Heidegger is saying there speaks to the dogmatic way in which Aristotle was interpreted throughout the tradition as providing definitive answers, always much more provocative of continuing to question. And the continuation and the deepening of the questioning in order to make sure that we fully understand the richness of the questions in all of their depth, as opposed to stopping short of that in order to provide an answer that we want the question to have, is going to be definitive in everything that follows. And as we're going to find out, the image that Plato's Socrates uses for this is following the logos. But we're going to get to all of that shortly. For now, all that matters is that Heidegger is questioning the long-standing tradition that Aristotle provides definitive answers instead of provocations to keep questioning. Concept and system alike are alien to Greek thinking. And so Greek thinking, therefore, remains of a fundamentally different kind from the more modern ways of thinking. And in that distinction between ancient Greek thinking and all thinking after the Greeks through the entirety of the Western philosophical tradition, up through and including modern philosophy, Heidegger has provided what is probably the best statement on why he's returning to the Greeks, and Aristotle in particular. And there's really just no way around it. Heidegger's claim is essentially that all thought after Aristotle has become lazy. Now, we need to be careful there because Heidegger spends his life focused on teaching not just the Greeks, but also thinkers of the Western philosophical tradition after Aristotle. And so in saying that the thinkers, the philosophers, and the theologians after Aristotle were effectively lazy, that absolutely does not mean that we can simply dismiss them and focus on the Greeks. That is not what Heidegger does. He's simply emphasizing the need to return to the Greeks and to Aristotle in particular, and to study them with the seriousness that they deserve. And what I mean by that is twofold. On the one hand, what that means is that we are emphatically not to study them as if some kind of mere antiquarian exercise in familiarizing ourselves with the thought of old philosophers who are simply no longer relevant. And so associated with that, on the other hand, that means that we are to study them, to learn them, with the belief that they have something to teach us that we ourselves do not already know. Because as Heidegger is going to argue, the originality of their thought has simply been lost through the millennia of tradition that has misunderstood them in the first place, and that's to say that a fundamental misunderstanding of the Greeks, and at least Aristotle, has become sedimented into a tradition of understanding philosophy in the West that we simply accept as true and don't question. And that's why I've included him in this discussion of Aristotle. But that being said, the overlap, or we could say the intermingling of theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge, and productive knowledge in Aristotle has as its precedence one of the greatest authorities in all of philosophy. It's very similar to the case with any of the Platonic dialogues. Namely, whenever a specific question is being asked, like for instance, what is courage or what is justice? Before you know it, the entirety of philosophy has unfolded. And so what initially starts out as a seemingly innocent question, for instance, about justice or courage, ends up being a discussion about the cosmos or being itself. And that's exactly what we find in Aristotle. And because that overlapping is so significant, the overlapping itself cannot be explained away in any significantly satisfactory way that retains the traditional, rigid separation of all knowledge into those categories of theoretical knowledge, practical knowledge, and productive knowledge. And we have to understand just how revolutionary that claim is, because what it entails is an absolutely necessary link between, for instance, what we understand as metaphysics And everything from ethics to politics and to rhetoric, just to name a few. We have to understand metaphysics or political philosophy properly, which means, again, understood according to how Aristotle understands them, and emphatically not the casual way that we tend to understand them, courses in the philosophy department versus courses in the history department versus courses in the theology department versus courses in the politics department versus courses in the literature department versus courses in the physics department, and on. And so you see what's encompassed in that claim is nothing less than an entirely new understanding of knowledge as such that we have accepted without question as being true as the model that's been given to us through the separation of the faculties at the universities. It's worth pointing out here that the recognition that all of the faculties come together to form the unity of truth undergirds the uni in the very word, the university. In other words, truth itself is the unity of all of the faculties. But we have lost sight of that in the modern world by way of further and further specialization. In other words, it used to be the case that the unifying principle of the university itself is that the truth is itself a unity of all of the various branches of knowledge being taught at the university. And so, unfortunately, it's much more appropriate to speak today of a multiversity instead of speaking of a university. And in fact, specialization is so prominent at all universities that in many cases, entire faculties flatly reject the validity or any truth to any number of the other faculties. If we want to be truly thoughtful, then we simply do not have the leisure or the luxury to claim expertise in something like philosophy without having an incredibly deep understanding of politics. And similarly, we simply do not have the leisure or the luxury to claim expertise in something like natural science without also having expertise in, for instance, ethics or politics or rhetoric. And that speaks again to just how invaluable Heidegger is as a guide into Aristotle. And again, that's also why I've included him in this discussion. And I fully recognize how someone could hear all of that and say, that is expecting too much. In other words, we simply cannot have that kind of rigorous requirement of expertise in so many different things. But keep in mind that we're dealing here with not simply great thinkers, but in fact, a few of the very, very rare, greatest thinkers to have ever lived. That's also why spending time with the great books is so incredibly rewarding, because it forces us to raise our expectations of what we consider to be great, rather than what you hear today very often of requiring that greatness be brought down to our level. The way we need to think of that is it speaks to the depth of Aristotle and the limitations of our own categorizations of things like physics, metaphysics, politics, ethics, poetry, etc. And related to that, to fields of inquiry that we wouldn't immediately expect to overlap, there's our theme of everything encompassed in our word, technology. And let me explain what I mean by that, because remember, technology is a very modern word despite being composed of Greek words. And more specifically, the most thoughtful Greek philosophers placed an absolute primacy on those two words, namely techne and logos, that constitute our word, technology. And yet, they themselves never used that word. They never made that combination. And so let me say a thing or two about that, because I think, at least I hope, you're going to be amazed at the lack of that word in Plato and Aristotle versus what it seems to be that they use in place of it. Now, first things first, before turning to Plato and Aristotle to understand what technology might be in their thought, we have to first make sure and clarify that we understand what we mean by this word technology for us today.